the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. How did Paul and John meet? Paul was in high school and John was, I guess they were both. What was the backstory there?
They were 14 and they were 15 and 16 years old, respectively, when they met. There was a church festival that was a key thing in Liverpool every year. Everybody came to it. It was called the Church Fete, Fete, and John and his skiffle band was slated to play for it, and they weren't very good at all, but they were part of the young kids who gathered to participate in this festival. And while John was performing on stage with these guys, he noticed a young guy in the crowd staring up at them. And this young guy, of course, was Paul McCartney, who came wearing a speckled sport coat, so he stood out like a sore thumb. And afterwards, backstage, Paul came back to talk to the band, and he grabbed the guitar out of John's hand and played an Eddie Cochran song that just knocked John for a loop. This guy knew how to play the guitar in ways he had never heard before. And Paul was, he was so outgoing. He just put his head back and sang and performed backstage for these young kids. He was younger than all of them. But Paul, being Paul, as we now all know, had an immense sense of self. And John knew from the start, well, he didn't quite know how to deal with Paul. He knew that somehow he had to attach himself to this guy. And Pete Shotton, who was John's best friend, recalled them walking home afterwards with John wringing his hands saying, I got to get this guy into my band, but I know if I get this guy into my band, it won't be my band anymore. and he was really torn by this. He didn't want to be upstaged by this guy. But his curiosity was too strong. He made friends with Paul, and as they say, that was history.
Mm-hmm. After they start playing, I guess they're playing sort of the 50s classics by the Buddy Hollies, Chuck Berry's, Little Richards. The skiffle scene is still happening because Paul joins in 1958, I believe.
I think they were calling themselves Johnny and the Moondogs for a while, Paul and John. And they were with Stu Sutcliffe, who was John's art school buddy who tried to play the bass. And they were playing little gigs around Liverpool. But they were also known, if you can believe your ears, as the worst band in Liverpool. Even once they started calling themselves the Beatles, nobody wanted anything to do with this group, the Beatles. They were terrible. I mean, they didn't have a drummer. They couldn't get it together.
They go over to Hamburg for the first time, and you paint a picture of a city in Germany that it just shocked me what went on in Hamburg.
So they got this offer to go to Hamburg, to play in Hamburg. The scene in Hamburg was incredible. It was filled with American sailors and sailors from all over the world. And they were in a place called the Reeperbahn, which the Reeperbahn was like 42nd Street before Rudy Giuliani cleaned it up. I mean, it was as seedy as you could get. There was just dive bars everywhere, girly shows, drugs everywhere. And it was run by a group of thugs. But these thugs also hired English rock and roll bands to come play and entertain. And so the Beatles were given their chance to go to Hamburg to do this. They needed a drummer. They enlisted Pete Best.
Yes, yeah.
Who hadn't really played with them before. And really they didn't love because he had a heavy foot, a bass foot. and but they made do, and they had Stu playing bass, and Stu was terrible. He couldn't play bass to save his life. Um, but they went to Hamburg and they got themselves settled into playing gigs in Hamburg, and they became the Beatles there. This is where they became the Beatles. There was a German promoter who was not at all satisfied with their playing, and he kept sitting out front saying to them, mach show," which was, make a show, do something. So the Beatles realized they had to turn on the gas, and they did. They learned how to perform in Hamburg, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because there were bar fights while they played. The soldiers were rough. The girls were rough. They had to play over all of this chaos, and they had to play 7 hours a night. They only got a brief 15-minute break every couple hours. So they needed all this material. They needed to learn how to make a show. And the book, my biography of the Beatles, opens up the night they come back from Hamburg to Liverpool. We are at a gig, a big concert that they've been signed on to play. There were signs all over the Beatles, direct from Hamburg. And so all the kids thought they were a German group. They had no idea who this was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it was an amazing scene. There were all these young girls in party dresses and boys in their best suits in this voluminous ballroom. And the Beatles came on in black leather jackets, black leather pants, and played a style of rock and roll that these kids had never heard. They had never seen anything like it. They had never heard anything like it. And that night was the night that the Beatles really came into their own. They became Liverpool's band, and they took off from there. It was an amazing ride, being in Hamburg and coming back to the city and reclaiming it as their own.
Bob, let's talk about another person from Liverpool, Brian Epstein, the man who would go on to manage Beatles to their worldwide fame, but who, when he first heard of the Beatles, knew nothing about rock and roll. It would blew me away that he, knew nothing about that style of music. He came from this rich family. He was kind of the son who couldn't really find his place in that family.
Brian's family ran a huge department store called Nem's, Northeast Music Store. And Brian handled the record department. He was an opera and a classical music aficionado. He knew nothing about rock and roll, knew nothing about what was going on in Liverpool in the scene. But kids started coming into the record department asking for records, and not just records. They said, "Do you have anything by this group, the Beatles?" And of course, there was nothing. So Brian decided to go to the cavern to check out these guys himself. Um, Brian's little secret was that he was a gay man in a country where being gay was outlawed. And he immediately fell in love with the Beatles, especially John. He fell in love with their look, the whole sense of it, and he realized that something important was happening here. And so he made an overture. He asked them if they had a manager. The Beatles, a manager? I mean, they never heard of anything so professional. He'd put a little money into them, he'd buy them suits. They were, as the Beatles would say, they were gobsmacked. They had no idea how to deal with this, but they knew it was great and important to their future. And they knew that the the Epsteins ran Liverpool, and this was the guy. So they signed a contract with him. And Brian, knowing nothing about rock and roll, became the manager of what would become the biggest rock and roll band in history.
Ultimately, he runs the record store, and through that back channel, hears of the Beatles, attends their lunch concerts that they do at the Cavern Club. And the pace of which these guys play at both Hamburg and Cavern Club, they're playing 7 days a week and sometimes, and like multiple times a day.
Absolutely. They would do the two shows at lunch, and those lunch shows would be packed because all the young girls who worked in the shops around Liverpool would take their lunch break. They'd come to the Cavern Club for their lunch break and dance. Uh, so they do two shows at them, and they do three shows maybe a night, and maybe two shows at the Cavern. Then they'd hop on a city bus. They'd go through the tunnel, and they play at one of the ballrooms in the city. I mean, they work their butts off. I under I understood that when I talked to Paul about it because I had done the same thing with Bruce Springsteen in the early days. So
Hmm.
I we played three, sometimes four shows a night.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
that's what you do,
That's what you did to build the audience.
Right.
The one of the things that surprised me as well, there was many things in this amazing book, was Brian Epstein's influence on the image of the Beatles because he felt that they were scruffy, that they were not clothed properly, they were talking on stage, they were drinking. Tell us a little bit about that because we all believe the Beatles had the pristine image, but not before Brian arrived.
No, when they played the Cavern, they smoked on stage. They'd drink whiskey, they'd get plastered, they'd talk to the girls, they'd do shout outs. They would drag a girl up on stage and dance with her. They had no discipline whatsoever. They just ran the place the way they wanted to run it. And Brian, he was a proper gentleman. He was a guest. Um, so he laid down some laws. If you're going to work with me, if I'm going to work with you, you're not going to smoke on stage anymore. Well, I mean, the Beatles not to smoke on stage, that was a hard thing for them. You couldn't crack jokes. You had to play songs. You couldn't just chat among you. The Beatles would chat among themselves for like 5 minutes and then maybe they'd play something. Um, so he kind of, as Brian would say, smartened them up. And he even went so far as to put them in suits. Can you imagine? I mean, they were in suits. Uh, um, and he changed their image was very important to Brian because Brian knew that if he was going to take this band out of Liverpool to London, where he knew it had to go, then they had to look like somebody who could play on it was Saturday night at the Palladium, which is tantamount to our Ed Sullivan show. That was Brian's goal. He wanted them to be in show business. Um, that's the way he saw things, and so it was tough for the Beatles to go that route, but they knew that Brian had their best interest at heart, and he swore he'd get them a record deal. The first album is called Meet the Beatles.
The Meet the Beatles. The first album, Meet the Beatles, has a few hits on it. I saw her standing there.
Love Me Do was their first single.
We,
They and Ringo didn't play on it. Well, I mean, we could go back even a little more. They went there with Pete Best. They knew that Pete Best was not going to be their drummer. They wanted to go after the best drummer in Liverpool, and they knew who that was. It was Richie Starkey, Ringo's star.
Mhm.
Uh, and they stole him from another band that was playing around Liverpool.
Mhm.
Um, but when he showed up at George Martin's studio, George Martin felt Ringo didn't have the right beat, and so he hired a studio drummer to fill in for Ringo. Um, George said he always regretted doing that later on because Ringo, as we know, turned out to be a magnificent drummer. Um, but they wanted to do anything they could to please this guy. They wanted to get a record out.